Thank you, and good morning, everyone. So, as Deborah said, I'm the Director of Publishing Ethics and Integrity at Taylor and Francis Group Journals, and I'm going to give you the publisher's perspective of this particular problem. So, who are my team? We, in a way, like sort of to pick up on some of the points that David had mentioned, and Susan as well, it's really important that we can objectively assess any kind of ethical issues. So the ethics team at Taylor and Francis, we sit not within the journals, we sit kind of almost like as an umbrella team over the journals. Now, why is that important? It means we don't have those close relationships with the editors. We don't have, ties towards the revenues that the journals are actually targeting. We're not involved in any of the kind of journal development issues. So we basically work across all of the STM and HSS journals. It's a real mix of models. We have open access, we have hybrid, you've got subscription journals. We publish across STM and HSS, but the one common denominator is we see ethics issues in every single one of these journals. It just looks a bit different, feels a bit different, but there are issues across all of that. So I'm not going to go through the entire list, it's pretty self-explanatory, but I will focus on the fact that we have a driving role in the investigation process when it comes to an ethics concern. So just for context, if there's a quite straightforward issue that's raised, someone says, oh, we found this article is plagiarized, my team don't need to see it because you can see it's plagiarized, they can just deal with it as they need to, we don't need to know. But as soon as it becomes complex, or if there's a batch, if there's a trend that's emerging from an author or a journal, that's when we get involved and it gets escalated to us. So just for context, I took on this role in 2019. And at that time, my team received 175 ethics cases. And when I say a case, it can involve multiple articles. So that year, maybe our biggest case had 20 articles from one author group. Last year, we had almost 2,000 ethics cases. So we're just losing our minds here. But it really goes to show how much additional scrutiny there is on published content, quite rightly, but also editorial processes, again, quite rightly. And it is, in a large way, thanks to people like David Sanders, where we've become more aware of the kind of image manipulation issues that are being missed during the editorial and peer review process. So we also are always looking at our editorial policies, and that's because, yes, of course, there are editorial policies that are very standard. We have, human research ethics guidelines, animal ethics guidelines, et cetera, But the world changes, our awareness and sensitivity around issues change, technologies change, so we're always having to adapt our editorial policies to make sure that we're giving appropriate guidance. So I've listed some there. We're all talking about ChatGPT nowadays. That's just one of the latest examples. Geopolitical issues, that introduces new types of ethics issues. What do we do about that? And other kinds of dual-use research of concerns. So just to give you a flavor that the editorial policies aren't static. It's something we're always working on, always monitoring. So I mentioned we see cases across our entire portfolio, but year on year, these are our top 5. It doesn't matter even if we're growing from 175 to almost 2,000. These are our top 5 ethics case types. Data, you can see, makes up more than half. And when I say data integrity issues, I'm also talking about image manipulation. And it's not all paper mills. I would say about 50% of the cases we have at the moment are paper mill cases. The other 50% is a whole other mix. And even those contain issues like data and image manipulation. And authorship issues are there all the time. It can be to do with disputes. It can be to do with ghost authorship, authorship for sale. Plagiarism is always there. And by plagiarism, I don't mean just text plagiarism. It's plagiarism that it could be plagiarism of ideas, which is a real pain to be able to get to the bottom of. And often these are quite extended investigations. It can be thesaurus plagiarism. So yes, you can run it through Authenticate. It's not showing you, flashing up as a score, but you look at it closely and you're like, no, you've just changed some of the words there. So it can be any type of plagiarism, but it's always in our top 5. Duplicate submission and publication, again, always a problem. And then other kinds of behaviors. And when we say misconduct behaviors, this can be really from any stakeholder. It can be authors, it can be reviewers, it can be editors. And that leads to a whole other set of complexity. So I'm not showing here specifically paper mills, but they can be in any of these groups at all. So this is our standard process. So this is what my team will follow when we're doing an ethics investigation. And what I will raise here is that we have to be really careful with how we conduct an investigation. We have to be really mindful of introducing any kind of biases into the process, because if we do that, then it becomes compromised. And there's going to be a pretty big result at the end. So it might be a retraction, or it might be, no, there's no problem here. Either way, that's a big thing, right? So we have to audit every part of our process. So the concern can come from absolutely any direction. It can come from the editors themselves. It can come from colleagues who've noticed something odd in the submission or production system. It can come from readers, such as David. It can come from the co-authors as well, raising an issue. Journalists, whistleblowers, even the institutions, and also our team, my team. So if we see a trend that's cropping up, if we see this author's name keeps coming up or this topic keeps coming up, then it triggers an additional audit, additional investigation. So the first thing we do is we review what is the exact concern that has been raised, because more often than not, that ends up not being the only concern. So it might be that someone has said, oh, I'm worried about the data in this article. But then we look at it a bit deeper and we go, actually, there's something odd about the method. So is the peer review process okay? Is there something systemic that we need to be worried about as well? So it goes through a set of checks on top of that concern that was raised. And then it depends if the article was published or not. That triggers another line that we follow. And this is often where contacting the authors comes in. It's very rarely the institutions in the first instance. Our contractors with the authors, they're the ones we put the queries to, and then whether or not they respond also leads to a different set of events. We typically give 2 weeks, but we do bear any public holidays in mind based on where the authors are. And then if they provide us with the information we're asking for, whether that's the data files, whether that's anything else, that leads to another set of checks. It might be at that point we have to pull in additional experts to assess, for example, the data or the stats. And that really is the most crucial point, because when we have that, we're hoping this will now be enough for us to determine what is going to be the outcome. Now, with paper mills, they have no problem sending us data. They will send us files. They will spam us. And I think they're just hoping or assuming we're not going to check. But when we open up those files, you can see it's just a bunch of nonsense. It's nothing that actually is evidence of the correct work. But many times, the authors have sent us appropriate files. And so that's why we assume nothing. We have to always approach it we have to be as objective as possible and assess accordingly. And so I'm not going to go all the way through to the end because we're pressed for time. But basically, these are the main steps that we will take, whether an article is published or not, and whether it's going to end up in a retraction or a rejection if it's not published yet. So we follow COPE guidelines on those particular steps. So these are generally a correction, retraction, expression of concern, or removal. But the main point I would make here is that the wording we put in our retraction and expression of concern, we really try to stick to the facts. We don't exonerate authors. We don't even point the finger of blame to a specific author unless an institution has actually come to us with further evidence. We just want to stick to this article is no longer valid for these reasons. And these are the kinds of common issues that we come up with. So you saw the top 5, but these are the recurring ones. And what I can tell you, this list has got longer and longer over the last 2 years. I used to have like about half of this. And as we've become aware of new trends, new types of issues, it gets more and more complicated, including things like special issues or compromised stakeholders. And you can have compromised stakeholders at every step of the process, including suppliers. So that's something we have to be really, really careful of. But in red, where I have in red, these are the points that we are more likely to contact an institution. And that's because we require assistance from the institution either to get a response or for further evidence. So the challenges really are, it's actually the responses. So often when there's a concern, we will always try to give the authors a right of reply. It's their paper, it's their reputation. We want to hear from them. When they're not responding or when they're evasive, it does delay the process. And that is a big challenge. And then it comes to the institution. It's really difficult to figure out who do we contact at the institution. We scour the homepages. Some institutions don't have homepages. So sometimes we end up finding the email address of the dean or the head of department in just some hope that we can find someone. And again, that leads to delays. Often don't get a response from the institutions, and we often find out we have disconnected investigations. So we sometimes find out through a third party that actually the institution is investigating this author or that author group, but we only found out because we found a PubPeer comment that mentioned that. But we've been trying to contact them, and actually we've been been doing our own investigations. Or we hear from an institution after 5 years saying, well, you contacted us 5 years ago, we've now completed the investigation, you can retract. We're like, what are you talking about? And then it kind of comes back to that point of, all we need to know is there's a problem with the data. We don't need you to complete the entire investigation. That's all we need to know. We can move on. And then the real problem when authors are not connected to an institution, that's a real pain point. Because if they've conducted research and they're independent, it really depends on what they've done, what the study design is, because we look at a lot of risk, and also where they're based. What are the rules where they're based, if any at all? Establishing level of required evidence. What is evidence? Well, that in a way is sometimes subjective. What is evidence? What is it that we need each stakeholder to know for us to move forward? Another pain point is when it gets very, very controversial. So it's a controversial topic, but it's scholarly. Is it scholarly or is it something else? Is it something more personal? Again, that leads to two different outcomes. And finally, to link up to Susan's point, is the most important thing is understanding each other's barriers, because once we do that, we can just move much, much, much further. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.